Welcome everyone to the Open Wallet Foundation Wallet Interoperability SIG meeting for May 18, 2026. Today our guests are Brendan and Alberto, who are going to be presenting KEYRING, issuing peer-to-peer relationship credentials on top of Bifold. We're really excited for these folks to join us and to share their work and an implementation of one of the OWF projects, so that's going to be pretty great. As with all of our wallet interoperability SIG calls, this will be recorded and it will be on the wallet interoperability SIG playlist on YouTube. I'm going to put the link to both the agenda page that I'm sharing right now, as well as a link to this YouTube channel in chat in like a moment. But also it'll be here on the wiki page as well. As with all Linux Foundation meetings, this is held under the Linux Foundation antitrust policy / competition policy. If you have any questions about these matters, please contact your company counsel, or if you're a member of the Linux Foundation, please contact Andrew Updegrove of the firm Gesmer Updegrove LLP, which provides legal counsel to the Linux Foundation. In addition, this is held on the Linux Foundation Code of Conduct, which can best be summed up as be excellent to each other, and we're going to get a ton of work done. I've got a couple little bits of announcements. The architecture SIG is happening right after this meeting. I'm going to put the link in the chat in a moment. Our community calendar for the rest of this week going into next week. Tomorrow, the Bifold community call, where I'm going to be sharing this video. If we don't get any Bifold folks in today, they're all on the West Coast, so it might be super early their time. Occupy Maintainers call is tomorrow. And for folks following along, the Occupy Maintainers call is on week A, and the Occupug, the Occupy user group meeting, is on the opposite week. So this week is maintainers, next week is user group, following week is maintainers, that sort of thing. The Multipass community meeting is also happening tomorrow. Thursday, May 21st is the Credo community call. Definitely check that out. That's an awesome team. There is no wallet interoperability SIG for next Monday. It is a national holiday in the US. I know we have a huge European contingent in our community, but for right now, I might not be around, so we're going to cancel that call. We are having the next wallet interoperability SIG call on June 1. I'm going to give folks a heads up on that. Tuesday the 26th, we've got Acapug meeting, the Multipass meeting, VCX's meeting on Wednesday the 27th. There are two other meetings on that day I'm going to add to the wiki page. And on Thursday the 28th, we've got the brand new growth project UDPLO. They had their first meeting last week. They're doing every other week as well at the same time as the Credo call. So check that out. In addition, we have the Global Digital Collaboration that is happening September 1, 2, and 3 in Geneva, Switzerland. There is a link for tickets in the wiki page, and there is a session proposal form in the wiki page. If you've got a session you want to propose at the GDC, by all means do it. Our next wallet interoperability SIG call is on June 1, and the topic for that is interoperability and conformance testing for EIDAS 2.0 era and beyond, a community-driven approach with Lau, Petros, and Nikos are going to be joining us, and thanks to Harm Orenhorst who hooked us up with these great speakers. With that, I am going to stop sharing because none of you came here to listen to me. You came here to talk to Alberto and Brendan, and I'm going to turn it over to them. Alberto and Brendan, please, could you just introduce yourselves and take it away?
Absolutely. Yeah, Alberto, if you want to put up the slides, that'd be great. So I'm Brendan Miller. I'm a principal engineer with the Applied Social Media Lab at Harvard University. Do you want to introduce yourself, Alberto?
Yes, Alberto Leon, Senior Software Engineer at the Applied Social Media Lab at Harvard, and I work alongside Brendan, of course.
We have two other team members. I'll get to them on the next slide here, joining us as well. So thank you for joining us. But so we're talking about our application KeyRing, and we're doing peer-to-peer issued relationship credentials and experiments on top of that. We'll tell you more about it. So this is our team. Yahaira Gonzalez is our product manager, and Nicole Brennan is our senior UX designer, also on the call. Thank you for joining us. And they've been very intimately involved with all aspects of this, of course. So we're just, Alberto and I are leading this one just for kind of simplicity of the presentation. And next slide. So we're going to go through a couple different things. We'll kind of outline a problem statement and why it matters, the work that we've been engaged in. We're going to talk about our solution from an engineering and a design side. Alberto is going to do a live demo for you, so appreciate him stepping up for the tightrope walk of live demos, but I'm sure it'll go great. We'll talk about some additional use cases and what's next for our project, and there's some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. So we'll give you a little motivation for our work. Next slide. So our starting point is social media. And before I get into this, I will mention it in more detail later, but just wanted to really thank the Open Wallet Foundation and Bifold community for your work. It made it so much easier for us to do this type of demonstration and work. So just wanted to really appreciate, all of your work over the years, excellent work. And so, yes, then thanks for your interest in what we've been doing. So the problem, we start in social media, but there's use cases more broadly. So I just want to mention a few of these things I'm sure are familiar to you. Proof of personhood, who's a real human and who's a bot online, a very important question. Content provenance, or where does this content come from? There's a lot of concerns about misinformation, disinformation, just manipulative content. So that's another concern. Many governments and jurisdictions are experimenting with age assurance to make sure that people are of a certain age to access certain content, and how can that be done? I mentioned the misinformation, and then there's just ways that the current proprietary platforms have been implemented, which is not ideal. So having centralized data stores, makes them big targets for the personally identifiable information that's within them, or just misuse, for reasons beyond the scope of what the users might have intended. And then what you can call walled gardens, or the lock-in that happens. You get onto a certain platform, they have all of your friends and contacts there. It can be very difficult to move, even if you would like to, if you'd like some other kind of choice for your social media. So these are some of the framing interesting problems that we believe our work can touch on. So next slide. So just our belief here, online trust can be restored by building unified user-centered systems where individuals own and control their digital identities. I think this community is probably, understands those principles and why we are seeking to move in this direction. Next slide. Vision, advancing digital identity in a responsible and ethical way. Mission, building unified identity systems where users own and control their data. Next slide. So some of the key principles that we've tried to put into our work, these are guiding principles. So we want it to be secure, of course, portable. I talked a little bit about this idea of, not wanting to be locked into one platform or another. You should be able to take your data with you. Should be interoperable. So again, we're working with open standards, open protocols, privacy preserving by default. People should have a choice about what to share. And then very usable, should be an experience that can work for everyday users. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our solution. If you go to the next slide. So these are kind of three key principles at the top: verified, private, portable. On the right side, you see two folks with our application open. And so if you start advancing, so for the first time, two people can meet face to face, verify each other through their own devices, and walk away with portable proof of that connection. No company or government in the middle. And I think there's one more, right, Alberto? Oh, okay, sorry. No, just in any case,
Yeah.
this is kind of the punchline. So this is what we're trying to do. We're leveraging the wallet infrastructure, the credential infrastructure, and we're trying to introduce that into the social sphere so that people can have proof of their connections that are really under their control. Next slide. If you continue, so I'll talk a little bit about some of our engineering contributions. So we have implemented so far 3 layers of trust in our wallet, and we expect that this will be growing in the future. many of us have experienced government forms where you need to select two items from column B and one item from column C, where you're assembling signals that can demonstrate your identity, that you are who you say you are. And so we're applying this in a bottom-up digital way. So we're leveraging three right now and expect to add more in the future. The first is the device biometrics. So these are local biometrics, the face unlock, the thumbprint unlock on your phone. And so this indicates that the device owner authorized the exchange. So that's one level of trust. The in-person connection, this is designed to be used in person. So it's a QR code exchange. One phone scans the others. So two people met and chose to connect. So that's the next layer. This is an in-person exchange. And then this third one will take a little bit more time to describe to you, but let's call it a witness context. So the exchange happened in a verified setting. So I'll say a little bit more when we get to that slide, but we've designed this to be done in a privacy-preserving way. No centralized storage is required. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to dive a little bit more into these. I think many folks are familiar, certainly from the user side and maybe even from the implementation side. So you can the face or thumbprint or fingerprint unlock is bound to keys that are stored in a secure portion of the phone and can only be accessed, through the biometric face or fingerprint unlock. So this creates the ability for a signing key to be linked, to that person and can only be used by that person. So that's one level of trust. That's the first base layer based on the device itself. Next slide, please. The next is this in-person exchange. So as you'll see, Alberto will do a full demonstration for you later. But basically, one person scans the QR code of the other, and then credentials are issued one to the other. So person A issues to person B issues to person A, and then each wallet stores those credentials. I will mention that this is based on work also happening under the Linux Foundation. There's a decentralized trust graph working group, which is working on the credential schemas and the protocols for this type of work. And so we're participating with a broader community of people through that working group to establish these new credential formats. So you'll see in a little bit, there's a variety of credential types. And so this is meant to be fully interoperable, what we're building on here, and a demonstration of these credentials. Next slide. And so now this is the witness layer, the confirmation from a trusted observer. So think about most relationships. They happen within some trust community. So that's a terminology that we use to just link whether it's an official institution or whether it's your local sports club or whether it's your family. Each of those is a trust community. So the idea is that any of those could run a witness service. This is a server that basically allows you to, once you do that relationship credential exchange that I described on the previous step, you could submit it in a privacy preserving way to the witness, and the witness can say, aha, okay, this has happened in my context. Maybe we're at an event together. We could be, we are running one right now for this session. And you can imagine it happening in any kind of event or any kind of organizational context. And so it puts an organizational stamp onto those relationship exchange. And so this is another way in a bottom-up kind of system to add additional trust. So the fourth line here, it says the third party can verify this exchange was observed by, for example, the wallet interop SIG at the event on May 18th, 2026. At the regularly scheduled call. So you can add this kind of witness information that can increase the trust in these credentials. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the different types. So you can see the link if you're interested to the Trust over IP working group, the Decentralized Trust Graph working group. where you can find these credentials. And we've been a part of the group and contributed the first draft of these credentials. So this is based on some work of Drum and Read, and the First Person project has flowed into this Linux Foundation working group. Folks have been working on something like this for a long time, and it's starting to really take shape now. So you can have the relationship credentials that I mentioned, the witness credential. Our cards are like relationship cards, or it's basically like a business card. So that's the human readable data that you choose to share with another person. And you can have different personas. Maybe I have a work persona, maybe I have my sports club persona, and I can choose to share different information in those contexts as I see fit. You can also link a persona credential, which is basically, I should also mention for the technically minded folks, all relationship credentials by default are pairwise private, meaning I create a new decentralized identifier for every new relationship that I form, regardless of whether I have met that person in another context. So this is the privacy preserving kind of heart, where can be no correlation between relationships formed by default. So, but if you want to correlate it, you can add a persona credential to say, okay, I know Alberto, and I'm choosing to share my public did, let's say my work did, through the Applied Social Media Lab, and link it to my relationship credential with Alberto, so that people can, he has some evidence that I am that public or semi-public persona. So again, that's a choice that we can both make. Endorsement credentials are another one that's vouching. So to say, okay, I can issue a credential. I've worked with Alberto for 2 years at the Applied Social Media Lab, and so we can vouch for each other. And I mentioned the trust communities, and this is another important part of the model, is that you can invite people to be a part of a group, a trust community, an organization, an institution, and then you can get a membership credential. That's the last one. So these are all compatible with privacy preserving zero knowledge proofs, and they're intended to be composable and nestable. So organizations can use relationship credentials to form organizational level relationships, and one organization or trust community can be nested inside of another. So the idea is to make a new fabric for trust online in a decentralized way. Next slide, please. So our approach has been to, work on the standards, make sure that we have an open foundation for what we're doing that others can use as well, participate in those communities. We're architecting new solutions and proofs of concept. So our 3-layer trust architecture is a beginning example of that, is to say this is one way to architect trust. And so we've contributed to that work. We're making everything we do open source. It is already open sourced and will continue to be. Again, it's based on your open source from the Bifold project and the Credo project. And then we hope that this feeds, we have one usable app ourselves, the one that you'll see demonstrated here. We know of at least one other company that has implemented the same credentials and in a different application. And so we hope that that continues to grow and we can have more and more use cases based on this. Next slide, please. So here are some, by the way, we'll make this presentation available to Sean to share with you all. But you can access our 2 repos here. We have a wallet and a Bifold repo. And then this is also the third QR code is to the decentralized trust graph credentials. And so, these are the brands, if you will, that we're proudly affiliated with, all open protocols, open source organizations, and you very much a key part of that. So thank you again for all of your great work there that we're able to leverage and contribute back to. Next slide, please. So design considerations, I'm going to pass to Alberto now. He's going to talk a little bit about what went into the design. And again, thank you to Nicole, our designer, for her excellent work here. And he'll also then continue on with the live demo portion. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brendan. And thank you, Sean and the Open Wallet Foundation community for having us. Yes, so I'll just briefly talk about some of the great design work that our colleague Nicole was able to do on the Keyring wallet. So, of course, we leverage a lot of the UI elements already existing from Bifold. And we just tailored it for our specific use case, which was more for peer-to-peer credential exchanges. We wanted to make sure that the user experience was an easy one and a usable one, as well as transparent. As you will see, there is an onboarding part to the wallet that, of course, Bifold also implements, which tells the user what the wallet can do, some of the features, and some of the security aspects to it. And of course, we always want to empower users through always having a choice when using the wallet. So throughout the demo, you'll see moments in time where you can opt out of different scenarios or features. For example, when I connect to another wallet or start an exchange, I can decide not to do it. So always empowering the user and making sure the experience is in their control. All right, so I'm gonna go through the demo here, but actually before I get into that, I want to talk through some of the different trust scenarios that you'll see here. So one, there's two basic features you'll see in the demo, and there's three types of trust signals, or like Brendan has described it, levels of trust. So one thing you'll see during the demo is you can use biometrics to unlock the wallet, but also the biometrics will allow you to sign credentials when being issued to another wallet. And of course, you can do this within a witness context. You can imagine going to like events. If the Open Wallet Foundation were to hold an event, we're actually considering this call as an event itself. You can connect to the organization event witness, and that's another trust signal that you can build on top of the connections you make at the event. So in this first scenario, you have two wallets, A and B, and both have connected to the witness or the organization event and have decided to turn on biometrics. Biometric is always an opt-in option for users once they start using the wallet. We've noticed that some users just, for whatever reason, will not trust using biometrics on any wallet. So, of course, we've always give that option if they want to, do it when they create these relationships. The second scenario, and just one more thing on this one. This is the one I'll be demonstrating, and the following two, I'll just show a few screenshots since I'm only working with two wallets at the moment. But just to go through the second scenario is what happens if one decides to turn off biometrics for the credential exchange. So for this, they can still create the connection with folks who wish to connect with them or build relationships. It's just that you'll get a different type of signal from that relationship. And we have a cool graph that we'll show during the demo that can illustrate a little bit what that graph looks like. But it is an optional thing. The other one is you can always connect with someone, people you meet that's outside of an event, and you can also choose to create relationships with them. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with the demo. I'm just gonna switch here moments the view so it's everyone can see. So on the right-hand side, you guys are seeing two wallets running on two different devices. On one side, you have an iOS device, and then on the other side, you have an Android device. Both are running KeyRing Wallet, which we'll make available for folks at the end of the presentation with some QR codes if you guys want to test this out. And what I'll be going through right now is just the onboarding of the wallet, which of course I think for most of the people here in this community might look very similar. Um, all right, so I'll open up the wallet. So the very first thing we first do a fresh install, you'll see a welcome screen. which goes through a carousel of features and abilities of the wallet. So here's a basic welcome. We've added some links here that will take you to the actual project website, which will give you some more information about us and the project itself. And then we talk about digital credentials, even though in this demo we'll be demonstrating a peer-to-peer issuance. We still hold the ability to hold regular credentials from organizations to a wallet, which is a typical flow from Bifold. That's still available. That's one of the great things about working in the open source realm is that you can just build on top of it. So we did not suppress any of those features. Simply, we just kind of built the peer-to-peer exchange, which was very helpful from the Bifold community to have some of that already implemented in the developer options. Yeah, so this part here of the informational carousel, we've added this part where it just talks about creating trusted connections, being able to create relationships with no third parties involved. And of course, everything is designed securely. And I'll just press here to get started. And probably very familiar for most folks here at the community, you'll set up a pin. So we'll go ahead and just set up a simple pin here. Create the pin. And then I'll stop here for 1 second and talk about the biometrics aspect. So the biometrics has two functionalities if you choose to turn it on. The first one is it will unlock your wallet, but it will also sign credentials once you issue them to another wallet. And we'll see that in just a few seconds. And I'll press continue. I've decided to turn this on. I can name my wallet. This is we recommend setting like a username, your initials, whatever you like. This is mostly what the other wallets end will see once you scan each other's QR code. So I'm just gonna put my initials here and I'll say continue. And then here might be a little bit different to what you would see typically in the Bifold wallet. We've just added this last onboarding step where you can create an R card. And as Brendan previously mentioned during the presentation, this serves as a form of a digital business card, which your basic information. Right now, we have some really basic information that you can set up, like name, last name, email, and the organization you belong to. So what I'll do is just go ahead and start filling this in, and I'll just fill in my name here, my last name, an email, and some of these are optional, and the organization I belong to, which is the Applied Social Media Lab. And then I can just go ahead and press continue, and the wallet will start to initiate. So we'll give this a couple of seconds, and there you go. And this is the first time I'm actually onboarding the wallet, of course, and you have a tour guide that will take you through the different screens to kind of guide you to the different features and functionalities, of course, based on some of the bifold work. And here we have just the contact screen, and then if I press next, we have an icon to the top right of the wallet where you can see the witness verification screen, which will have some information to the different organizations you connect to, or for example, the events. So you'll see that in a couple of seconds as well. So I'll just press done to exit out the tour guide, and you have your home screen for the wallet. So you have various types of tabs at the bottom. Some of these might look familiar to this community again. So one of the things we did add is a contacts tab. Here you'll see for example, like in your phone book from your regular OS device, you'll be able to see all the contacts you connect with, or you could call them wallets as well. And then you have messages, which can hold DIDCOM messages which you can actually message other contacts you've connected with. QR code will just give you two options. It'll let you scan a QR code or generate one. And then wallet. So the wallet is what I mentioned at the beginning. You can still get organizational credentials from organizations. And then menu, which holds some basic feature, enablement of either deciding to turn it on or off. You have the ability to turn off biometrics. You can secure exchanges. So that means when you connect with another wallet, you'll be able to actually sign those credentials through the device's secure enclave. And then we have some other information here, which is very typical of most wallets. And again, I'll be repeating a lot of this, but very familiar to this community, most likely. All right, so also just real quickly, I have here reporting enabled by default. There's a good reason to do that, but you can always turn that off. And this is a privacy preserving reporting mechanism. You're not reporting exactly what you're sharing. It's just to show here for in a couple of seconds the graph that we'll be forming. So let me go ahead and just open up first the other side of the wallet, the other wallet on Android, and give that a couple of seconds. And let me actually just turn this on. Gonna initiate that on Android, and I've already onboarded on this one, so I don't have to take you through the whole onboarding experience. But now I'm going to go here and switch over to my web browser. And you'll see here we have a witness server running, which was mentioned by Brendan. So what this is you can imagine this is the event of this call that you can onboard to. And this will give me that witness context when I exchange. So I'll be demonstrating that full exchange trust demonstration. So for this, of course, I'll go ahead and scan this QR code. I'm going to enable permissions for my camera. And here we go. So I've connected and I'm going to just switch over to my second tab here just to show you guys this graph. So just to kind of explain what you're seeing here on the iOS device is since I have that reporting feature enabled, it's reporting back to the witness with a pseudonymous name and a temporary DID, which is connecting me and creating a DIDCOM channel with this event, right? It could be any event. People can set up, events for different sessions. It could be including, different communities, like Brendan mentioned. It could be my church, my family. So for the moment, I've connected to this event itself. And one thing to mention is we also worked really closely with the BCE wallet code base to actually enable some of these features. But this is basically me connecting to this meeting call. And one of the things that we have here that's kind of fresh out the oven is we've actually enabled an agentic feature, which is some of our stuff we're trying to experiment, and we'll talk more through the presentation. So I can actually have a conversation with this event. So I can say something like, "What is Bifold?" and send that through this. And this, of course, is a DIDCOM channel, peer-to-peer communication. So you see here, I'll respond back, right? It has most of it from the context of the wallet itself. It's telling me Bifold is an open source wallet, which is what KEYRING is using to be built on top of. So this is just one of the features that we're experimenting with. So of course I've connected here now. I can go back, and what I'll do now is this other wallet, let's call it John Doe for the moment, the Android wallet, has decided to join this session and be part of this community. I'll go back to here to the actual QR code, press the scan QR code, press continue, give it permission, and then scan the QR code. And there you go. So now we've just did the same thing, but on the other end, but now we have these two nodes on this graph here. Again, these are just pseudonymous random generated names with temporary DID identifiers, just so you guys could see this graph. That is just for demonstration purposes. So when we go to events and we show keyring, you could see like this graph will fill up with dozens and dozens of nodes, and then they'll start connecting. So this is just to show people how graphs form and how connections can form, but this part of the demo is not necessary, and I think most people will not probably run this if they fork the open source code. So, okay, I'll just go back here to home on both wallets. And what I'll do now is generate a peer-to-peer exchange, which is what we've been talking about and probably what most people are waiting for here. So one end, I'll say generate QR code. And so one side we have the generated QR code, and then I'll say scan QR code on the other end, and then I'll scan it from the other wallet. All right, so these are scanning and they're connecting. And all right, so now I've connected to each of these wallets, and it's asking me to confirm biometrics to actually sign the relationship with the private key that lives under the secure enclave. So I'll go ahead and confirm biometrics. And this might not work because I am running a test device um, on a test device. See, let's see here. All right, I'll confirm it on the other end. But that might be okay. So you guys could see what it looks like when two different people on different ends decide to either cancel or enable the biometrics. Okay, so right now, basically, you're seeing JD on one end and an AL on the other end. So these are the usernames or the wallet names that we set up on the onboarding. So I can decide to either accept or reject this credential. So I want you guys, I guess, to see here, and you can see on the graph already, they're starting to form a relationship. Is on one end, I have a verified exchange. This verified exchange is saying it was verified by this call, the Open Wallet Foundation SIG, as just a demo, of course. And I'm starting to see the other wallets information. And then on the Android side, we have one more banner which says it was a secure exchange because on one end I signed the actual exchange with the secure enclave that allowed me to get this secondary banner on the other end. So basically, once I formed the relationship, I could see this information and say, okay, yes, I know, Alberto or John Doe, and I'll decide to accept this contact and we'll form the relationship. And there you go. So these, of course, are verifiable relationship credentials, is what we're calling them, and they are W3C VCs. And there you go. So I'll press done, and if I look at my contacts tab, I will see John Doe and then Alberta Leone on the other end. And as you can see, if I click on Alberta Leone, I have these two badges which indicate that, this was signed by the other end with their enclave. And then the verified badge indicates that it was witnessed in a secure manner by this event. And you can see some of the actual data here that, the date and who it was witnessed by, the organization, in this case, OWF. And yeah, so that's pretty much the demo. And just to finish off here, if I go back to the presentation, um, if I were to do different use cases where people were either part of the, let me actually make this a little bit bigger so everyone can see. Here we go. So this is a screenshot taken. There's different types of trust as you start forming relationships. Some might be part of an event. Some might be just people you meet, at a cafe, and others might decide to, turn off biometrics. So these are the different use cases. So John Doe has, is just someone I connected with, not part of the event, decided to turn off biometrics. Nicole Brendan decided to connect with me with biometrics and under a specific event. And then Yahira decided to connect through only an event itself. So, when I say through biometrics, I don't mean that we're storing in any way biometrics. It's just that the biometrics is the access through which we get to the ability to sign through the secure enclave. And that what gives us device attestation, basically. And all right, so that's pretty much the demo. I'm gonna kick it off back to Brendan.
Yes, thanks, Alberto. And I just want to also make the point that Alberto did some excellent work on the biometric attestation of credentials. So it's cross-device between Android and iOS, and you can add an attestation and verify it on the other side. So this is in our code base and may be of interest to builders out there. Wanted to call that out. And the witness functionality is also something new that we built as a part of this. So yeah, happy to talk about that if any folks are interested. Next slide, please. I'll just move through this quickly. As Sean noted there, if you have questions, raise your hand. We can start to, we're getting near the end here. Just wanted to start to talk about some of the implications or what we can do with this. So we have already um, done in a separate project where we have taken using some protocol and a open source package called TLS Notary um, to notarize your X account. That you control it with, you don't need the permission from them or a special API. You can verify your account. And we have attached that on Blue Sky. Blue Sky is just an example of an open social media platform that we can modify. And so it adds a badge on your social media platform so that you can see, oh, I have a verified X account. And we want to do something similar with these relationship credentials. So, I have followers and following folks on different platforms, and I could add this kind of attestation under my control to those to say, hey, I really do know this person. I've met him at three or her at three different events. And and so we can add these trust signals to other platforms and keep it under the user's control. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we can attach these relationship credentials to open social media. One thing that we're planning to do and interested to do with some partners is proof of personhood. So how can you combine maybe some traditional credentials with some relationship credentials in a privacy preserving way using zero knowledge proofs to have some notion that we have some enough signals here to believe that this is a person. So, that is that's something that could be very helpful. Content provenance, we can track how content flows through a social network over this decentralized trust graph that we're building. And again, make zero knowledge proofs that maybe it came through a channel through our relationship network or not. Next slide, please. And so there's also some kind of governmental use cases, age assurance. Let's say a parent has a government credential, and maybe we develop a scheme where they can vouch for their minor who doesn't have a formal government ID yet to help with some of these age assurance challenges. So that is a different model than what is currently being contemplated. But with this trust graph, we can do that. And I think many people would prefer that over privacy invasive types of strategies that often don't work. We don't have great solutions there yet. Also imagine folks who don't have credentials yet, formal government credentials. Maybe you're unfortunately like a refugee or homeless or even just minors. Minors don't have a government ID in many cases. So how could you progressively build up some identity assurance over time? So that age assurance is kind of a subcategory of that. We can also come up with new decentralized fraud signals that are going to be more privacy preserving than these centralized databases that are being formed right now. And that AI functionality that Alberto demoed, maybe that can be used for matchmaking, either to match people up at a work event or maybe for government services or mutual aid. Could be used for a lot of purposes, and people can choose to disclose what they want to and then get matched up as a result through their trust community. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, and as Alberto demonstrated earlier, we added this agentic response. Right now, it just tells you some general event information about the wallet or the event. But again, it could become, having some peer shared information there that could be interesting within certain trust communities. Next slide. And just wanted to thank you for your interest and again for all the great work on Bifold, Credo, etc. over many years. And this is a new direction. So we're moving away, not away, but we're expanding into, social peer-to-peer credentials on top of institutional credentials and exploring what can be done there. So I wanted to thank you for your interest. We're open for some Q&A. If Alberto's going to put up the next slide, which is this is where you can download our app and try it out if you'd like. It's designed to be used in person, so it's especially good if you have someone else in your office that you could try it with. These are just in test flight, or kind of pre-release mode. So it's still very much a work in progress, but we'd love your feedback. You want to try it, please do. And happy to take any questions or comments. And thanks again for your interest.
First of all, I want to thank Alberto and Brendan and the entire team for joining us today and showing off. That was a great demo and really appreciate y'all sharing your context. I'm also having flashbacks to 2017, 2018, where we were working on cards as a metaphor for how we express identity. So that was really good stuff. One of the things you showed, Alberto, was this idea of the level of assurance in that did exchange. Like two people used biometrics, one did, one didn't. Because you've exchanged DIDs, because there's a DID-COM connection between them, I can later on request, hey, can you use the HSM on your device? I want to step up this relationship. That is an opportunity that's there as well, correct?
Yes, so we do have some open tickets where we're gonna be able to do a little bit more than what was seen in the demo, like even
Sure.
including adding personas. But yes, you're completely right, Sean. Even though and I like the how you framed it, a level of assurance. That's definitely the inspiration behind some of the UI elements that we use with the badges. But yes, since I've already connected with the other wallet and established one, I can request as well. It's not currently implemented in the app, but that's the idea. It wouldn't take a lot of effort to actually build that. And like I said, we have some open tickets for that, where I can tell, hey, John Doe, can you sign this relationship again or try to do it and request it. And I can always eliminate the contact if that's my personal policy, if
Right.
you will.
The rails are there, more importantly. Thank you.
Yes,
That was
definitely.
awesome. Everyone on the call, by all means, please raise your hand, speak up. Questions for this team. We really appreciate it. Romik, you're up.
Hello. Thanks for your talk. It's good as ever. Um, okay. First question I have is, could we use this to do signed document exchange? So if I had a signed document to prove I was over 18, could I send it to you peer to peer without using some other way of doing it?
I would
That's the
imagine
first.
so. It's a standard DIDCOM channel, so you could send a variety of data formats over that. And so, yeah, that could be another kind of, once you've confirmed a relationship to your satisfaction, maybe additional documents need to be shared for certain purposes. So I do think
Because
I don't see any problem with that.
because that's what I'm missing. I'm missing the next level, which is to say, okay, I've made a link between the two parties. What next, sort of thing. So it's like the other thing I have is what happens if someone loses their device? That's the other thing I was seeing from your work.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's been on our mind. Alberto didn't show it. We have a very simple, version one solution of that in the settings tab. If you scroll down, you can export and import your wallet.
Yeah,
So that's a very clumsy way to do it, but you can get an export. It's password protected, so you can. Yeah, he's going to show it here. Export, import of your wallet. But of course, in the long term, we'd want some kind of very easy to use synchronization type system. Again, it's nothing that we've built now, but you're right that whenever you're like any wallet, if you're storing important stuff in that wallet, you need a way to recover or synchronize or access it, if you lose access to that device.
and my third point is witnessing. Uh, in the UK, that implies a stronger form of document exchange. If you have a signed document exchange with a witness, it means you can do property exchanges, for example. That's what it's used for in the UK. So be
Hmm.
aware that while witnessing, in some ways, having only one witness can be a problem. You probably need a Byzantine general exchange on that for doing three witnesses and choosing two of them, one for each party and one independent. And
Okay.
secondly, to make it more of a legal standing. So you mentioned the the I can't remember what it is, the Berkeley Klein Center, I think it is. Um,
Hmm.
but it's like trying to give a grounding to a legal actual entity to try and get some sort of legal standing for doing this. That would be the other thing I'd be seeing from this. Anyway, I'll let David talk now.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
No, thank you for your interest. These are all good points. And yeah, we struggled. Initially, we called it a notary, not a witness.
Yeah,
And we understand
yeah,
that that has even more loaded meaning.
yeah, yeah.
So we tried to do something more general. But yes, if witness is
Yeah.
a legal term, we want to be
You have
careful
Yeah,
to
you have to
mean.
be careful with witnessing and you have to be careful with vouching because those things are have legal load to them. Because vouching means you're trusting the other party to actually say this person is okay. Those two things are very heavily legally weighted, those two things. So you have to be very careful with them.
Good
Anyway,
call.
I'll let David. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you. Yes, we're not intending to say that we're reaching that level of legal threshold at this point. So it's good to know in the UK that those
But
terms.
you're building towards it. That's what I'm saying here, because your level of assurance with your witnessing, with your vouching, is building to a strength of legality beyond what you're trying to aim. Anyway, okay, I will park now.
Thank you.
David Alexander, you're up.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was late, but I found the tail end of that absolutely fascinating. Um, One question you mentioned briefly, content provenance. Are you investigating C2PA, which is live and active? And I wonder what your thoughts about that might be.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent standard. We have that's an adjacent group. So we're most active in the decentralized trust graph working group under the Linux Foundation. C2PA is also, working on their standard. We know some of the folks there. Eric Skelton is working on that. And so the hope is that our decentralized trust graph can link up with those C2PA credentials. That work has not been done yet, but it's certainly something that everybody thinks would be valuable to because they're kind of different dimensions of trustworthiness. You're signing this artifact, by the creator, but then you also want to know, perhaps how it traveled to you, through what kind of institutions or other parties.
And no modification in transit. Absolutely.
Exactly, yes, and to be able
Um,
to do like
and
zero knowledge proofs of that,
yeah,
exactly.
and just to build on Romik's points about vouching slash witnessing, the UK government has published a guide on what is acceptable vouching under GPG 45 and 44. So if you want a link to that, you can see how they're trying to apply that in the UK as a way of upping the assurance about the identity of an individual. And needless to say, people that can vouch have to exist on a register and have to have achieved a level of identity assurance before they can perform that function. And there are restricted groups classified under that area. But it's a really important way of eradicating what we call friction, effort, risk, and cost for people and improving trust end to end. So, really good to see you doing this. I didn't hear if this is an open source initiative. I'm
It is.
assuming it must be.
Yes, it
So,
is. If you, Berta, would you mind going back to that other slide where the repos are listed? Again, it's mentioned in our slides.
oh, I
I
missed
can
that.
copy them back into the chat here. But yes, it's open source. It's based off of a Bifold and work from the BC government. So yes, we are also released under the same license, Apache 2.0. And yes, so it's open and will remain open.
Brilliant, Brendan. Thank you very much. And Alberto.
David
Thank
Kelch,
you.
you're up.
I'm curious about the access to the trust graph, like how that is accessed. I mean, you gave an event example. You could see like the event app or the event organizer, but also like sort of permanent graphs. how that control, what the concepts of control of that are and access to it. Both like who gets it and how they would get
Yes,
that
good
access.
good questions. So by default, we've enabled reporting by default in our app right now to help make this visible. You know what the Trask graph looks like and so on. That's really for demonstration purposes. Many folks would not have any kind of reporting, and then you are using a unique decentralized identifier for every additional relationship that you make. So there's zero correlation possible. But what you saw with that graph is an intentional exposing of a pseudonym, a stable pseudonym for each person so that you can start to see the graph form. That pseudonym is also not linkable to any other aspects of your real life, but we felt that it would be helpful for this trust community to be able to see, that the network is forming, at least for folks as we demonstrate this. But you could imagine some organizations, maybe a networking organization, et cetera, where they would want some of this information to be exposed and people would opt into that. But the point is it should always be opt-in and under a user's control.
Awesome. Thank you, David, for the question. I'm going to get the last question. How can we help? What do you need? Alberto and Brendan, how can the Open Wallet Foundation and our community help? What can we do for you? You mentioned before and you shared the QR code. You wanted folks to kick the tires on the on your wallet app, but how else can we help?
Yeah, Alberto, could you put our email addresses back up on there? So we welcome any contact if you have suggestions, ideas. These ideas that have already been shared about the vouching and the witnessing in the UK are very interesting. So use cases are valuable. Kicking the tires is useful. Feature suggestions, requests, use cases. And if you want to just use the code, add anything to what you're doing. We just want to continue to engage and see how this can be useful to folks.
Outstanding. And once again, I'd like to thank Brendan and Alberto and the entire team from the Harvard Berkman Center. That's where I got my start in a lot of this open source work, thanks to Project VRM. But thank you so much for showing off the work that you're doing with Bifold. As some of the folks on this call know, my my worst days when I walk into a room and find out somebody's using one of our projects. I was like, wait, no one told me about that. So this is awesome to see it in action. Thank you all to this team for putting it together. The video will be up on YouTube probably a little bit later this evening, my evening, y'all's afternoon. And thank you, everybody. We meet again in 2 weeks, and we're going to be talking about interoperability and EIDAS. So by all means, join us in 2 weeks. Next week, there will not be an interop SIG call. Thanks a lot,
Thanks,
everyone. Have
Sean.
a great day. Bye, y'all.